Judge Edward Chen walked into court ready to humiliate Pam Bondi. But just minutes later, the gavel dropped on him. The legal community braced itself for what promised to be a courtroom spectacle, a confrontation between two titans, one cloaked in the authority of the bench, the other armed with the resilience of a seasoned advocate. What happened next stunned everyone in the courtroom. It was a moment that would ripple through the hallowed halls of justice, challenging perceptions of power, integrity, and the very foundation of the judicial system. The federal courthouse in downtown Miami buzzed with anticipation on that humid Tuesday morning. A palpable energy, distinct from the usual hum of legal proceedings, permeated the air. It was a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and a collective sense that history might be made within these walls. The Miami sun, typically a relentless presence, seemed to hold its breath, casting a muted light through the tall, arched windows, hinting at the drama to unfold. Journalists jostled for position in the packed gallery, their laptops balanced precariously on knees and notepads at the ready. The clatter of keyboards and the soft rustle of paper formed a muted symphony of eager anticipation. Every seat was occupied, and latecomers stood shoulder to shoulder along the back wall, craning their necks for a better view. The murmurs of conversation were hushed, punctuated by the occasional flash of a camera or the hurried whispering of a reporter briefing a colleague. Today's hearing had attracted national attention, not just for the high-profile corruption case on the docket, which itself was fraught with intricate details and powerful players, but more significantly, because Florida's former Attorney General, Pam Bondi, would be facing off against Judge Edward Chen, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him like a dark shadow. His name alone evoked a sense of unyielding strictness, a judge who wielded his authority with an almost surgical precision, often leaving a trail of humbled attorneys in his wake. Judge Chen swept into the courtroom at precisely 9 a.m., his black robes billowing behind him like storm clouds gathering before a tempest. His entrance was less an arrival and more an assertion, a dramatic punctuation mark that commanded immediate and absolute silence. The subtle creak of the door, the soft scuff of his polished shoes on the polished floor, every sound seemed amplified in the sudden stillness. At 58, he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who truly believed his position made him untouchable, an unassailable arbiter of justice whose pronouncements were final, his decisions beyond reproach. His movements were deliberate, each step calculated, conveying an air of impregnable authority. His wire-rimmed glasses perched on a hawkish nose, giving his gaze a piercing quality, and his thin lips seemed permanently set in a disapproving line, a subtle but constant judgment etched upon his face. There was no warmth in his demeanor, no hint of approachability, only a cold, severe professionalism that seemed to push away any challenge. "All rise," called the bailiff. His voice, though a practiced bellow, seemed to echo with unusual resonance through the suddenly silent room. The collective scraping of chairs as everyone rose in unison added to the solemnity of the moment. It was a ritual of deference, a recognition of the power embodied by the robed figure now ascending the bench. As the proceedings began, Pam Bondi, immaculate in a tailored navy suit, approached the podium. Her blonde hair was pulled back neatly, framing a face that, despite the mounting tension in the room, betrayed no emotion. Her posture was poised, her movements economical and precise, projecting an aura of quiet strength and unwavering professionalism. She held herself with an understated confidence that belied the formidable challenge she was about to face, a silent counterpoint to Chen's overt display of power. Her gaze was steady, meeting the judges without wavering, a testament to her experience and her resolve. Before she could speak, Judge Chen's voice cut through the air like a scythe, sharp and dismissive, laced with a preemptive disdain. "Ms. Bondi, I see you're representing the defense today. I must say, I'm surprised you've taken on such a complex case given your record." His emphasis on complex and your record was not merely rhetorical. It was designed to sting, to undermine her credibility from the outset. The words, delivered with a thinly veiled contempt, sounded less like an observation and more like an outright insult, echoing with derision. A faint ripple of unease spread through the gallery. Seasoned court observers recognized the tactic. the subtle but deliberate attempt to disorient an attorney, to rattle their confidence before they had even opened their mouth. Bondi's expression remained neutral, her face a mask, betraying absolutely no emotion, a testament to years of facing down adversaries in the courtroom. She did not flinch, did not react, her composure a shield against the judge's provocative words. She merely absorbed the insult, processing it, her inner thoughts hidden behind an impenetrable exterior. "Good morning, Your Honor." "Yes, I am lead counsel for the defense," Bondi replied, her voice clear and measured, her southern accent a soft, controlled cadence that added an unexpected layer of calm to the charged atmosphere. She did not rise to the bait, did not engage with the underlying insult, choosing instead to stick to the formal language of the courtroom. Her response was brief, precise, and utterly professional, a stark contrast to Chen's provocative tone. She stood firm, an unyielding presence, a granite monument against the judge's verbal assault. Chen shuffled through papers on his bench, not bothering to look up, his attention feigned, his disinterest a deliberate act of disrespect. He allowed a moment of heavy silence to hang in the air, amplifying the weight of his next words. "Let's hope you've prepared more thoroughly than in your last appearance in my courtroom. We wouldn't want another embarrassing performance." This was an outright public rebuke, delivered with chilling nonchalance. The gallery collectively winced. The last appearance was a widely known incident, a previous case where Chen had indeed systematically dismantled Bondi's arguments, seemingly delighting in her discomfort. A ripple of palpable tension spread through the gallery, an audible shift as reporters subtly leaned forward, their pens poised. Everyone present knew of the last case where Chen had repeatedly interrupted Bondi's arguments, his gavel coming down with harsh finality on her every attempt to speak, and had denied nearly every motion she filed. Systematically stifling her defense at every turn. It had been a public spectacle of judicial overreach, a clear demonstration of Chen's willingness to exert absolute control, even if it meant bordering on impropriety. What they didn't know was that Bondi had spent the past 6 months preparing for this very moment, not just for the legal arguments of this specific case, but for the anticipated personal attack from Judge Chen. Her preparation was not merely about winning the current case. It was about laying the groundwork for something far larger, something that had been meticulously planned, each step calculated with chilling precision. She had anticipated his every move, every sneer, every dismissive wave of his hand. Her strategic response was not improvisation, but the execution of a carefully rehearsed plan. "I assure you, Your Honor, I am fully prepared," she replied, her southern accent slightly more pronounced now, a subtle tell to those who knew her well that she was keeping her temper carefully in check, holding a fierce inner resolve firmly under wraps. It was a minute shift, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, but to those who understood Bondi, it was a clear signal of her heightened intensity, a sign that her composure was not weakness, but a tightly wound spring ready to release its energy at the opportune moment. Her eyes, though still neutral, held a depth of quiet determination, a silent promise of the battle to come. For the next 40 minutes, Judge Chen maintained his hostile demeanor, a relentless barrage of thinly veiled contempt directed squarely at Bondi. He questioned her every statement, twisting her words, misinterpreting her intentions, and injecting sarcasm into his every query. His voice was a constant undercurrent of skepticism, designed to chip away at her confidence and discredit her in the eyes of the jury and the public. He allowed the prosecution considerable latitude, granting their requests with a nod, even interjecting supportive comments, while restricting Bondi's responses with an iron fist. Each time she began to build momentum in her defense, to present a cohesive argument or introduce a compelling point, he found a way to interrupt or dismiss her points, cutting her off mid-sentence, declaring her lines of questioning irrelevant, or simply waving her off with a dismissive gesture. It was a suffocating display of judicial bias, designed to create an uneven playing field. In the gallery, seasoned court reporters exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and growing indignation. Chen's behavior crossed the line from merely stern to decidedly unprofessional, venturing into territory that bordered on outright abuse of power. They typed furiously on their laptops, capturing every egregious comment, every unwarranted interruption. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces reflecting a growing awareness of the disparity in treatment. Their gazes darted from Chen to Bondi, a subtle but clear indication that the judge's overt partiality was not going unnoticed. Their expressions ranged from mild discomfort to open disapproval, the seeds of doubt about the fairness of the proceedings slowly taking root. Throughout it all, Bondi maintained her composure, a remarkable feat under such relentless pressure. While lesser attorneys might have crumbled under Chen's relentless pressure, succumbing to frustration or anger, she responded to each barb with respectful but firm replies, her voice never rising, her tone never wavering from its calm, authoritative pitch. Her adherence to decorum in the face of his impropriety only highlighted Chen's increasingly erratic behavior. Those closest to her, particularly her co-counsel, could see her occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad, not frantic scribbles of someone overwhelmed or panicked, but deliberate, measured documentation. Each stroke of her pen was precise, a methodical record of judicial misconduct, a detailed chronology that would later prove invaluable. She was not simply defending her client. She was building a case against the judge himself. Brick by calculated brick. That as the morning session neared its conclusion, Judge Chen looked down at Bondi over the rims of his glasses, a look of condescending triumph on his face, as if he had successfully worn her down. We'll recess for lunch. Miss Bondi, I suggest you use the time to reconsider your strategy. At this rate, your client might want to explore a plea deal. The words were delivered with a smug satisfaction, a final cutting remark to underscore his perceived dominance. Several members of the prosecution team smirked openly, clearly enjoying Bondi's public humiliation. Believing that Chen had indeed broken her spirit, it was a moment of shared triumph, a collective belief that the defense was on the ropes. Bondi simply gathered her materials with unhurried precision, her movements calm and deliberate, a quiet act of defiance in the face of his condescension. She did not rush, did not show any outward sign of distress. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard clearly throughout the courtroom, a subtle assertion of her presence. "I look forward to continuing after the recess." Her response was polite, even deferential, on the surface, but beneath the words lay an unyielding confidence, a hint of something more to come. Her eyes, though still impassive, held a flicker of steel that as Chen rose to leave, fully absorbed in his own perceived victory and oblivious to the subtle currents shifting beneath the surface. He didn't notice Bondi's co-counsel slide a thick manila folder onto their table. It was a folder stamped with federal markings that hadn't been there when the session began, its presence a silent but powerful indicator of undisclosed information. Nor did he notice the tall, stern-faced woman who had slipped into the back row. During the proceedings, her Department of Justice credentials hanging from a lanyard around her neck, her gaze fixed intently on the judge. She was a silent observer, a shadow in the back, but her presence was a harbinger of the storm that was gathering, a storm that Judge Edward Chen, in his arrogance, couldn't see, too blinded by his own hubris to perceive the impending tempest. The air in the courtroom, though seemingly calm on the surface, was thick with unspoken truths and brewing retribution. When court reconvened after lunch, the air in the room seemed heavier, charged with unspoken tension. The initial buzz of the morning had been replaced by a taut, almost electric silence. The reporters were back, their numbers having noticeably increased, a testament to the morning's contentious proceedings and the whispers that had spread through the courthouse during the break. Judge Chen returned to the bench with the same imperial bearing, a regal air of undisputed authority, but now there was something almost theatrical about his disdain, an amplified performance of his earlier scorn. He settled into his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips, as if relishing the prospect of continuing his public dressing down of Bondi. The gallery had swelled even further during the break, word having spread like wildfire about the morning's contentious proceedings, drawing in more legal professionals, students, and curious onlookers. "Ms. Bondi," Chen began without preamble, his voice dripping with condescension, a dismissive tone that left no room for polite introductions. "I've reviewed some of your filings during the break. I must say I'm struggling to follow your legal reasoning." He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air, a calculated insult. "Perhaps you could enlighten us with your unique interpretation of precedent." His tone made unique sound like erroneous or incompetent. A few members of the prosecution chuckled openly, their laughter a brittle sound that grated against the courtroom's solemnity. One whispered something to his colleague who covered her mouth to stifle a laugh, a clear sign of their shared amusement at Bondi's predicament. Bondi stood, smoothing her jacket with a deliberate, unhurried motion, her composure unwavering. Her eyes, however, held a new, quiet intensity, a barely perceptible flicker of defiance. "I'd be happy to elaborate, Your Honor," she replied, her voice firm and clear, projecting an unwavering confidence that belied the judge's attempts to belittle her. "The precedent established in Harrison versus Miller clearly supports our position." "That Harrison versus Miller," Chen interrupted, his voice dripping with exaggerated condescension, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Really, Miss Bondi? That case was effectively gutted by the 11th Circuit just last year. I would have expected a former state attorney general to keep up with current jurisprudence." He leaned forward slightly, as if imparting a profound, undeniable truth, his expression smug. The insult was clear. She was out of touch, incompetent that in fact. Chen's assessment was entirely incorrect. The case he was thinking of was Harris versus S. Millbrook, an entirely different matter with no bearing on Bondi's argument. The mistake was glaring to any competent attorney in the room, a blatant error in legal knowledge that, coming from a federal judge, was frankly astonishing. That a subtle stir went through the legal professionals in the gallery. Some shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the judge's error and the blatant abuse of his position. But before Bondi could clarify, before she could gently correct him and expose his mistake, Chen continued his public dressing down, relentless in his pursuit of her humiliation. "Perhaps in Florida the standards for legal argument are more flexible," he said, prompting more barely concealed laughter from the prosecution table. His remark was a thinly veiled jab at Florida's legal system, further implying Bondi's incompetence and provincialism. "But in my courtroom, I expect counsel to come armed with more than charm and political connections." Several reporters furiously typed on their laptops, capturing every word of the judge's inappropriate commentary. His words, unprofessional and biased, were now forming a damning record. In the jury box, the jurors' expressions ranged from uncomfortable to openly disapproving, their discomfort a visible manifestation of their internal struggle with the judge's behavior. They exchanged glances, some shaking their heads almost imperceptibly, their silent disapproval a growing weight in the room. "Your Honor," Bondi replied evenly, her voice a study in controlled composure. "If I may direct the court's attention to the supplementary brief we filed, page 17 outlines the distinction between Harrison versus Miller and the case you may be referring to." She offered him a clear path to correct his error, a professional olive branch. Chen waved his hand dismissively, refusing to acknowledge his mistake, unwilling to cede even an inch. "Miss Bondi, I've been on the bench for 22 years. I don't need a refresher on case law from someone whose legal career has been more about press conferences than precedent." This time the mockery crossed a line so blatant that even some of the prosecution team looked uncomfortable, their earlier amusement replaced by a growing sense of unease. The Department of Justice observer in the back row, who had been an almost invisible presence, was now taking notes with focused intensity, her pen moving swiftly across her pad, capturing every single word and nuance of the judge's increasingly volatile behavior. Her presence, once subtle, now seemed to loom large, a silent but potent threat. Throughout the brutal exchange, Bondi maintained a calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with Chen's increasingly unprofessional behavior. Her composure was a strategic weapon, highlighting his impropriety and making him appear volatile and uncontrolled. She methodically documented each inappropriate comment, each procedural overreach, each instance of bias. Her legal pad now contained a detailed chronology of judicial misconduct that would make any appellate court raise serious questions, a damning indictment compiled in real time. She was building a case against him, not just verbally, but through meticulous record-keeping, every insult and dismissal serving as an additional piece of evidence. "Your Honor," she said after a particularly cutting remark, her voice unwavering, "may I request that my objection to the court's characterization be noted in the record?" It was a formal challenge, a procedural step that ensured his words would be preserved for further review. "Note whatever you wish, Miss Bondi. It won't change the weakness of your case." Chen looked around the courtroom, clearly playing to the audience, reveling in his perceived dominance. "In my experience, when attorneys start objecting to the court's tone, it usually means they've run out of substantive arguments." More smirks from the prosecution, more sidelong glances among the gallery. But now, there was something else in the room. A shifting current of sympathy toward Bondi, and a growing discomfort with Chen's behavior. The audience, initially amused, was beginning to turn, sensing the injustice unfolding before them. During a brief sidebar discussion with both counsels, Chen leaned in close to Bondi, his voice low, but still audible to those nearby, a menacing whisper meant only for her ears. "You're out of your depth here, counselor. Always have been. Your reputation won't save you in my courtroom." His breath, faintly tinged with coffee, brushed against her ear, but she remained impassive, her gaze fixed straight ahead. The words were meant to be a final, crushing blow, a reaffirmation of his absolute power. As they returned to their positions, Bondi's co-counsel slid another document across the table to her, a single sheet of paper carefully folded. She glanced at it briefly, her eyes scanning the content for a fraction of a second, then tucked it into her folio with a slight nod. The small gesture went completely unnoticed by Chen, who was too absorbed in his performance, too fixated on his own tyrannical display, to see that the dynamic in the courtroom was subtly shifting, like the tide turning almost imperceptibly, yet irrevocably. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype machine, capturing not just the words spoken, but the underlying tone, the subtle nuances, documenting the unfolding drama of a judge who had crossed the line from strict to abusive. And in the gallery, a court sketch artist captured the scene that would soon appear on every news broadcast in the country. Judge Edward Chen, his face twisted in smug derision, looming over Pam Bondi, whose composed expression revealed nothing of the counterattack she was about to launch, a meticulously planned assault on his authority and integrity. 3 hours into the afternoon session, Judge Chen's mockery had taken on an almost routine quality. It was a monotonous, yet oppressive, rhythm of disdain. Each time Bondi attempted to present her defense, to build her arguments, to call her witnesses, he found some new way to undermine her, to interrupt, to dismiss, to belittle. The pattern had become so predictable that a palpable weariness had settled over the courtroom, a collective fatigue born of witnessing such prolonged judicial abuse. The air was thick with the silent endurance of those present, until Bondi finally rose, not for another argument, but to formally present her defenses. Opening arguments. The audience braced themselves for another round of Chen's dismissals, expecting the usual interruptions. "Your Honor, before I continue with our defense, I'd like to address several procedural matters that have emerged during today's proceedings." She began, her voice taking on a new clarity and strength, a subtle but unmistakable shift in her tone that immediately commanded attention. There was a quiet power in her words, an underlying resonance that cut through the weariness in the room. Chen sighed theatrically, rolling his eyes for the benefit of the prosecution table. "Miss Bondi, we've already wasted enough time on procedural complaints, unless there's something substantive." His tone was dismissive, conveying his utter lack of interest in any further complaints. "There is, Your Honor," she interrupted, a direct act of defiance that she had not exhibited until this very moment. The small act of interruption, so subtle yet so profound, created a ripple of surprise through the courtroom. Eyebrows raised, reporters paused, and even the prosecution leaned forward, sensing an unexpected turn. "I would like to direct the court's attention to Judicial Canon 2A, which states that a judge shall respect and comply with the law and shall act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary." Her voice was calm, almost academic, but the words hung in the air with the weight of an accusation. Chen's expression darkened, his face contorting from dismissive boredom to a sudden, chilling anger. Are you suggesting that this court has failed to uphold judicial standards, counselor? His voice was low, dangerous, a venomous hiss. I am not merely suggesting it, Your Honor. I am formally entering into the record documented evidence of your failure to do so. The prosecution team exchanged alarmed glances, their previous smirks replaced by expressions of genuine concern and confusion. This was clearly news to them as well. Their whispered consultations grew more agitated. Bondi continued, her voice gaining momentum, an unstoppable force now. Furthermore, Your Honor, I would like to call Special Agent Marcus Rivera of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom, the kind of silence that precedes an earthquake. The notion of an FBI agent being called to testify mid-trial against a sitting judge was unprecedented, shocking. From the back row, Agent Rivera, the same stern-faced man who had been observing, rose and calmly made his way to the witness stand. He was sworn in, his hand raised, his oath spoken with solemn gravity, his presence alone a powerful statement. Agent Rivera, Bondi began, her voice clear and resonant. Could you please inform the court about Investigation 23JC 789, particularly as it relates to these proceedings? Rivera nodded, his expression grave, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom. With an unsettling calm. For the past 11 months, the FBI has been investigating a pattern of judicial corruption within this district. As part of that investigation, we obtained warranted surveillance of communications between Judge Edward Chen and several individuals with financial interests in cases before his court. The murmurs in the gallery erupted into a cacophony of shocked whispers. Reporters frantically typed, their keyboards clattering like hailstones. And what specifically did this surveillance reveal regarding the current case? Bondi asked, her voice cutting through the rising noise. Rivera removed a document from his portfolio, his movements deliberate and precise. We have documented 7 separate meetings between Judge Chun and Maxwell Harrington, the CEO of Gulfstream Industries, the primary beneficiary should the defendant in this case be convicted. He held up the document, its official FBI seal clearly visible. Bondi approached the evidence cart and removed a thick binder, its contents clearly substantial. Your Honor, I'm entering into evidence transcripts of recorded conversations between you and Mr. Harrington, in which you discuss, and I quote, ensuring the right outcome in this trial. She distributed copies to the clerk, who handled them, with trembling hands, to the prosecution, whose faces had gone pale with disbelief, and placed one before the judge himself. Chen's face had gone from pale to ashen as he stared at the transcripts before him, his eyes darting across the damning words. His previous arrogance utterly vanished, replaced by a dawning horror. His thin lips were parted slightly, a silent gasp of recognition. Additionally, Bondi continued, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the stunned silence. We have evidence of substantial deposits made to an offshore account linked to Your Honor, each deposit occurring within 48 hours of significant rulings favorable to Gulfstream Industries or its subsidiaries. The words landed like hammer blows, each one more devastating than the last. The lead prosecutor, a veteran litigator, named James Moretti, stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly across the floor, his face a mask of utter shock. Your Honor, the government had no knowledge of these allegations. We request an immediate sidebar. His voice was strained, a desperate plea for a private moment to grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. Chen seemed momentarily paralyzed. His eyes locked on the financial records now being distributed throughout the courtroom, his mind racing, desperately trying to comprehend the swift, devastating unraveling of his life. Bank statements, meticulously detailed wire transfers, and shell company documentations formed a paper trail that led directly to his chambers, a damning narrative of bribery and corruption laid bare for all to see. From the back of the courtroom, the Department of Justice observer, who had been a solitary figure, had now been joined by 3 more individuals, all wearing the unmistakable earpieces and discreet badges of federal agents. They watched the proceedings with calculated intensity, their presence an unspoken threat, the silent manifestation of a formidable federal investigation. Their arrival added another palpable layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere, making it clear that this was no longer just a courtroom drama, but a full-blown federal operation. Furthermore, Bondi said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, a chilling finality in her tone. We have evidence that Your Honor deliberately suppressed exculpatory evidence in 3 previous cases, resulting in wrongful convictions that financially benefited Gulfstream Industries and their affiliates. She gestured to her co-counsel, who activated a laptop connected to the courtroom's display system. Email exchanges between Chen and various parties appeared. On screen, their contents clearly showing judicial misconduct of the highest order, leaving no room for doubt or denial. These communications were obtained through legal federal warrants as part of an ongoing corruption investigation, Bondi explained, addressing not just the court, but the reporters frantically taking notes in the gallery, ensuring that every detail was fully understood and documented for public consumption. The jurors, who had been watching with increasing disbelief, their initial discomfort now turned to open shock, now stared openly at Judge Chen, their faces etched with a mixture of betrayal and revulsion. One older woman in the jury box slowly shook her head, her expression a mixture of profound disgust and crushing disappointment, the weight of the revelation settling heavily upon her. Chen finally found his voice, though it had lost all its previous authority, reduced to a trembling stammer. This is outrageous. These allegations are completely documented, verified, and corroborated by multiple sources. Bondi finished for him, her voice firm and decisive, cutting off his feeble protest. And there's more, Your Honor. She nodded to Agent Rivera, who produced a sealed envelope, thick with official seals, and handed it to the court clerk. This contains a formal request from the Department of Justice for an emergency suspension of these proceedings pending a full investigation into judicial misconduct. As the clerk, visibly trembling, delivered the envelope to Chen, the judge's hands visibly trembled, his fingers fumbling with the paper, his face a mask of disbelief. The courtroom, packed to capacity, held its collective breath, a unified gasp of anticipation and shock, as the carefully constructed facade of judicial propriety crumbled before their eyes, revealing the rotten core beneath. Judge Chen fumbled with the Department of Justice envelope, his fingers clumsy, his usual precision lost in the sudden onset of panic as he tore it open. The courtroom remained in a state of suspended animation. No one moved. Few even seemed to breathe as the judge scanned the document, his eyes darting frantically across the page, seeking an escape, a way out of the crushing reality. His face, previously ashen, now flushed with a mottled crimson that crept up from his collar, a physical manifestation of his shame and fear. This is procedurally irregular, he stammered, his voice thin and reedy, reaching for the gavel, as if its familiar weight might anchor him, might provide some last vestige of control. These allegations should have been filed through proper channels, not sprung in open court as some sort of publicity stunt. His desperate attempt to cling to procedural technicalities was a stark contrast to his earlier disregard for them. Pam Bondi remained standing, her posture relaxed, but alert, like a predator awaiting its moment. Your Honor, we attempted to address these concerns through proper channels 3 times over the past 4 months, she stated, her voice devoid of emotion, merely stating fact. Each filing mysteriously disappeared from the record. Her words implied a deliberate act of obstruction, further undermining Chen's integrity. After the 3rd attempt, we were left with no choice but to present our evidence in open court where it could be properly documented. She gestured toward the court reporter, whose fingers continued their relentless documentation of every word, a silent but powerful witness to the proceedings. For the record, copies of our previous filings along with delivery confirmations are included in Evidence Package B. The thoroughness of her preparation was astounding, anticipating every possible objection. The lead prosecutor, James Moretti, a man whose career was built on integrity and meticulous procedure, rose to his feet, his face etched with a profound sense of gravity. Your Honor, in light of these serious allegations, the prosecution requests a recess to confer with the Department of Justice representatives present in the courtroom. His gaze was directed not at Chen, but at the federal agents, a clear signal that the prosecution was now aligning itself with the forces of justice. Distancing themselves from the disgraced judge, Chen's eyes darted to the back of the room, where the number of federal agents had subtly increased. He was trapped, surrounded, his authority swiftly dissolving. Bondi's voice remained measured, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath her words. She motioned to her co-counsel, who approached the bench with a thick binder. This contains a chronological account of today's proceedings annotated with the relevant judicial canons that we believe have been violated. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the most seasoned reporters straightened in their seats, sensing the weight of this methodical indictment. Additionally, Bondi continued, I'd like to draw attention to certain inconsistencies in Your Honor's handling of this case compared to similar matters before this court. She began methodically outlining disparities in Chen's rulings, citing specific cases where he had allowed the very same arguments she was presenting when they came from other attorneys. With each example, she cited case numbers, dates, and specific rulings, demonstrating a pattern that went beyond mere strictness into the territory of clear bias. It was a forensic analysis of his judicial record, exposing a systemic prejudice. The color gradually drained from Chen's face as he realized Bondi had been documenting his behavior, not just today, but over months of preparation. Her research team had compiled a damning record of inconsistent rulings that suggested his hostility toward Bondi was personal rather than procedural. The systematic dismantling of his judicial impartiality was relentless and precise. Miss Bondi, he said, attempting to regain control, his voice cracking slightly. This court will not entertain unfounded accusations against. These accusations are not unfounded, Your Honor, she replied, sliding another document toward the clerk, her movements smooth and confident. This is a formal motion for your recusal from this case based on demonstrated bias. Under 28 U.S.C. Section 455, a judge must disqualify himself in any proceeding where his impartiality might reasonably be questioned. The legal foundation for her accusations was undeniable, a stark reality that Chen could not escape. The Department of Justice observer had moved closer now, standing at the back of the courtroom with an unobstructed view of the proceedings. Her presence a silent pressure. Several jurors were watching Chen's reaction with undisguised interest, their expressions a mix of condemnation and morbid curiosity. Furthermore, Bondi continued, her rhythm unbroken. We have reason to believe that Your Honor's impartiality in this specific case has been compromised by factors beyond the courtroom. She nodded to her associate, who distributed sealed envelopes to the court clerk, the prosecution, and the judicial assistant. These documents contain information regarding communications between Your Honor and parties with direct interests in the outcome of this case, communications that were not disclosed as required by law. For the first time that day, Judge Chen seemed genuinely rattled. He reached for his water glass, but found his hand was not quite steady, a tremor running through his arm. This is highly irregular, Miss Bondi, he said, his voice missing its earlier authority, now tinged with a desperate plea. Indeed, it is, Your Honor, she agreed, almost as irregular as a federal judge meeting privately with witnesses scheduled to testify for the prosecution. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor stood, his face a mask of confusion and profound shock. Your Honor, we have no knowledge of any such meetings. The court reporter's fingers froze above her machine for a brief moment before resuming their work with renewed intensity, capturing every word of this astounding revelation. The quiet tapping of her keys was now the loudest sound in a courtroom holding its collective breath, the air thick with disbelief. Chen's eyes darted toward the exit, then back to Bondi, who stood calmly waiting for his response, her gaze unwavering, her resolve absolute. The power dynamic that had defined the day had shifted completely, and everyone in the room could feel it, a palpable transfer of control. This court will take a 15-minute recess, Chen announced abruptly, his voice strained, a last-ditch effort to regain a semblance of control. Miss Bondi, I expect full documentation of these serious allegations when we reconvene. He slammed his gavel down, but the sound lacked its usual authority, a hollow echo in the suddenly charged room. When Judge Chen returned from the recess, the transformation was visible. His earlier swagger had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped formality that fooled no one. The lines of his face were drawn, his eyes held a haunted quality, and his posture, once imperious, now seemed rigid with tension rather than authority. The gallery had swelled even further during the break, as word spread through the courthouse that something unprecedented was unfolding in courtroom 4B. The news had spread beyond the legal community, drawing in more media and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the climax of this extraordinary drama. Miss Bondi, you may present your evidence regarding these allegations, Chen said, his voice carefully controlled, devoid of its former arrogance, now merely a mechanical utterance of judicial procedure. Bondi approached the bench accompanied by her co-counsel, who wheeled a small cart bearing 3 large evidence boxes, their contents clearly voluminous. Thank you, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I'd like to call as a witness Special Agent Marcus Rivera of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. A murmur swept through the courtroom as a man in a crisp dark suit rose from the back row and made his way to the witness stand, his presence alone confirming the gravity of the situation. After being sworn in, Agent Rivera identified himself. For the record, his voice calm and authoritative. Agent Rivera, Bondi began. Could you please inform the court about Investigation 23JC 789, particularly as it relates to these proceedings? Rivera nodded, his expression grave, his eyes sweeping across the courtroom with an unsettling calm. For the past 11 months, the FBI has been investigating a pattern of judicial corruption within this district. As part of that investigation, we obtained warranted surveillance of communications between Judge Edward Chen and several individuals with financial interests in cases before his court. Federal agents had now grown to 5. They made no move toward him, but their presence was an unspoken threat, surrounding the judge like silent sentinels, the machinery of justice turning its attention from the case at hand to the judge himself. I will consider these allegations, Chen said, his voice regaining some of its former authority through sheer force of will, a desperate attempt to cling to his crumbling power. But I remind everyone present that accusations are not proof, and I categorically deny any suggestion of impropriety. He looked around the room, his gaze pleading, hoping to find some flicker of doubt or support. Bondi tilted her head slightly, a subtle gesture of polite disagreement. With respect, Your Honor, we aren't merely offering accusations. Agent Rivera, could you please inform the court about the status of the evidence presented? Rivera cleared his throat, his gaze steady. All evidence presented today has been authenticated by the FBI Forensic Laboratory. The financial transactions have been verified through subpoenaed bank records from 3 countries. The recorded conversations have been confirmed by voice analysis to feature Judge Chen and the other named parties. The meticulous verification of the evidence left no room for denial. Each statement a nail in Chen's coffin, but Chen's legal training finally kicked in, a survival instinct overpowering his shock. This court will take a 30-minute recess. All evidence will remain in the custody of the court clerk. He rose abruptly, his face pale as he rose to retreat to his chambers. Bondi spoke again, her voice cutting through the silence before he could escape. Your Honor, given the nature of the evidence, we respectfully request that federal marshals secure the evidence during the recess to ensure its integrity. The implication was clear. She didn't trust Chen not to attempt to destroy or alter the evidence against him. The assembled reporters scribbled frantically, capturing every nuance of the unfolding drama, the subtle but damning suggestion of Chen's potential guilt. Chen froze, then nodded stiffly, his shoulders slumping. So ordered. He disappeared through the door to his chambers, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. As he disappeared through the door to his chambers, the courtroom erupted into a buzz of whispered conversations. The controlled decorum shattered, replaced by an excited murmur of speculation and shock. Bondi's legal team huddled together, their expressions serious, but with an undeniable undercurrent of carefully restrained triumph, their years of patient planning finally coming to fruition. The prosecution team had moved to a corner, engaged in an intense, urgent discussion with 2 of the Department of Justice representatives, their faces grim, comprehending the profound implications of what had just transpired. In the jury box, several jurors were openly discussing what they'd witnessed, all pretense of neutrality temporarily forgotten in the face of such extraordinary developments. One elderly juror caught Bondi's eye and gave her a slight nod of approval, a silent acknowledgement of her courage and strategic brilliance. Inside his chambers, Chen paced frantically, occasionally glancing at the phone as if debating whether to make a call, his mind a whirlwind of fear and desperation. His judicial assistant knocked tentatively. "Judge Chen, there are 2 FBI agents here who wish to speak with you." Chen's shoulders sagged. The fight had drained from him. "Send them in." Meanwhile, in the courtroom corridor, reporters huddled around their phones, breaking the story that was already sending shock waves through the legal community across the nation. Courthouse security had established a perimeter, keeping at bay the growing crowd of curious onlookers and additional media who had rushed to the scene upon hearing the initial reports, drawn by the scent of scandal and unprecedented judicial drama. Bondi stood apart from the chaos, phone in hand, listening intently to someone on the other end. Her expression revealed nothing, but those who knew her well would have recognized the slight softening around her eyes that indicated satisfaction at a long-planned strategy unfolding precisely as intended, every calculated step yielding its expected result. When the 30-minute recess stretched to 45 minutes with no sign of Judge Chen returning, a subtle, uneasy shift occurred in the courtroom. The federal agents, who had been positioned at the back, now moved to strategic points near the exits and the door to the judge's chambers, their movements deliberate, their presence becoming increasingly imposing. The court clerk, who had returned from a whispered conversation with someone in the hallway, looked visibly shaken, her face pale, hinting at the gravity of the discussions outside. But precisely 52 minutes after recess was called, the bailiff emerged from the judge's chambers. Instead of the usual announcement calling the court to order, he approached the Department of Justice representatives and engaged in a brief, intense conversation, his voice low, almost a conspiratorial whisper. One of the agents nodded and pulled out his phone, stepping into the hallway to make a call, the action a silent signal of the operation reaching its climax. Pam Bondi observed these movements with the calculated awareness of someone who had choreographed much of what was unfolding, her gaze steady, her mind processing every detail. When her co-counsel leaned over to whisper something, she gave the slightest shake of her head, a signal to wait, to allow the carefully orchestrated events to play out. 5 minutes later, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. With a soft creak, a woman in a tailored charcoal suit entered, her stride purposeful, flanked by 2 imposing U.S. Marshals. She strode confidently to the front of the courtroom, her credentials held aloft for all to see, identifying her as Deputy Director Lauren Vasquez of the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section. Her presence commanded immediate attention, silencing the murmurs. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs that had filled the room, strong and clear, resonating with the weight of her authority. "I am here to inform you that Judge Edward Chen is currently being detained pending formal charges of judicial corruption, obstruction of justice, bribery, and racketeering under the RICO Act." The courtroom erupted in shocked exclamations, a wave of gasps and shouts. Several reporters bolted for the doors, racing to be the first to break the expanded story, the explosive news reverberating through the legal world and beyond. Furthermore, Vasquez continued, her voice rising slightly to cut through the noise once it had subsided. "By order of the Chief Judge of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, these proceedings are hereby suspended. The defendant's case will be reassigned to a different judge, and a full review of all cases presided over by Judge Chen in the past 5 years will be conducted." Her announcement laid bare the extent of the corruption and the systemic measures being taken to address it. She turned to address the jury directly, her gaze firm but respectful. "You are all dismissed with the thanks of the court. You may be recalled when this case resumes under new judicial supervision." As the jurors filed out, many casting glances of grudging respect toward Bondi, Vasquez approached the defense table, her expression a mix of professionalism and quiet admiration. "Miss Bondi, I understand your team has additional evidence relevant to our investigation." Bondi nodded. Yes, Director. We've compiled documentation on 17 cases showing a pattern of judicial misconduct. My office will provide complete cooperation with your investigation. The lead prosecutor, Moretti, joined them, his expression grave, his earlier confusion replaced by a profound sense of responsibility. Director Vasquez, I want to state for the record that the prosecution had no knowledge of Judge Chen's activities. We'll be conducting our own internal review to ensure the integrity of our cases. I understand, Mr. Moretti, Vasquez replied, her tone acknowledging his team's unwitting involvement. For now, I suggest both legal teams prepare for a complete restart of these proceedings once a new judge is assigned. A commotion at the door to the judge's chambers drew everyone's attention. Two U.S. Marshals emerged, Judge Chen between them. The transformation was shocking. The imperious figure who had dominated the courtroom hours earlier now looked diminished, almost frail. His shoulders were slumped, his gait unsteady. His hands were secured in front of him with stainless steel handcuffs that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a stark symbol of his fallen status. Chen's eyes, vacant with shock, briefly met Bondi's as he was led toward the side exit reserved for prisoner transfers. In that fleeting moment of silent communication, understanding dawned in his expression, a raw, painful realization that his downfall had been orchestrated not through luck or circumstance, but through the patient, methodical work of the woman. He had so arrogantly dismissed that Bondi's face remained professional, betraying no emotion as the disgraced judge was led away. Only those closest to her might have noticed the slight squaring of her shoulders, not in triumph, but in vindication of the justice system she had served throughout her career. It was a subtle acknowledgement of the heavy burden she had carried, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice finally prevail. As Chen disappeared through the door, a court officer approached Bondi with a document requiring her signature, formal acknowledgement of the case's suspension. As she signed, camera flashes erupted from the gallery, capturing the moment that would dominate legal discussions and news cycles for months to come, etching her image into the annals of legal history. The courthouse, which had witnessed countless dramas of human justice and failure, had rarely seen such a complete reversal of fortune in a single day, a powerful testament to the resilience of truth. And as Bondi gathered her materials, preparing to face the media storm that awaited outside, the weight of what she had accomplished settled around her. Not just a victory in court, but the exposure of corruption that had poisoned the system she had sworn to uphold. It was a profound vindication, not just for her client, but for the very principles of justice itself. The scene outside the courthouse steps transformed into something resembling a media circus. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes extended toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight, their crews poised for the next development. Reporters jostled for position, microphones extended, camera operators angling for the best shot of what everyone knew would be the day's defining image. They didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes after the proceedings were suspended, the side door of the courthouse opened. Two U.S. Marshals emerged, flanking Judge Edward Chen. In the harsh Florida sunlight, the handcuffs binding his wrists caught the light, sending prism-like reflections dancing across the white stone steps, a stark, gleaming symbol of his downfall. Chen's face was a study in disbelief, the expression of a man whose world had imploded in the space of a few hours. His normally immaculate appearance had crumbled. His tie hung askew and a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead despite the courthouse's air conditioning, a visible sign of his internal turmoil. The marshals guided him firmly toward the waiting black SUV, navigating through the shouted questions and the blinding flashes of cameras. Judge Chen, do you have any response to the corruption charges? Were you working alone or are other judges involved? Did you target Pam Bondi specifically? Was it personal? The questions came in a rapid-fire barrage, each one piercing the silence. Of his shame, Chen kept his head down, offering no response to the barrage of questions, his face averted from the relentless glare of the cameras. The man who had begun the day by publicly humiliating an attorney, reveling in her discomfort, now couldn't muster the courage to face the public scrutiny he had so arrogantly brought upon himself. As the marshals helped Chen into the vehicle, his figure, once so imposing, now appeared utterly defeated, swallowed by the implications of his actions and the swift, undeniable hand of justice.